Mr. Johnson stood outside the grand glass doors of a bank in Springfield, feeling a mix of determination and anxiety. He had come to apply for a loan to expand his small business. But today, everything was about to change. As he pushed the door open, he was met with an unexpected and shocking sight. Inside, Mr. Jeff, the bank manager, was having a heated conversation with another customer. Suddenly, Mr. Jeff turned his stern gaze towards Mr. Johnson. "I'm sorry, sir," he said coldly, "but we can't help you today." Mr. Johnson was stunned. "Excuse me? I came here to discuss a loan for my business," he replied, trying to stay calm. Mr. Jeff's face darkened. "We don't do business with people like you. Please leave." Gasps and whispers filled the bank as other customers watched the exchange. Mr. Johnson felt a surge of anger and sadness. How could he be treated this way? Determined not to let this injustice stand, he knew he had to take action. But what could he do against a whole bank? Just as Mr. Johnson was about to walk away, Mr. Jeff grabbed his arm tightly. "Wait," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I think we need to talk more about this." Mr. Johnson hesitated, sensing that something big was about to happen. Was Mr. Jeff going to apologize? Or was there another twist in this unexpected encounter? The air was thick with tension as they stood there, both unsure of what the next move would be. The scene was set, and the story was just beginning. What would Mr. Johnson do next? Would he stand up against the racism he faced, or would the situation take an even more surprising turn? The answers were still unfolding, leaving everyone around them holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Earlier that morning, Mr. Johnson had woken up with a sense of purpose. He had been running his own small business for years, facing challenges and triumphs along the way. Today was important because he had saved enough money to expand his store, and he needed a loan to make it happen. He had chosen a bank in Springfield because it was close to his home, and had helped him before. Wearing his favorite blue suit and carrying his trusted briefcase, Mr. Johnson felt ready to take this big step forward. As he drove to the bank, he thought about all the hard work he had put into his business. He believed that with the right support, his store could grow and provide even more jobs for the community. He was excited about the possibilities and hoped the bank would see the same potential. When he arrived, the bank looked impressive with its tall glass doors and polished marble floors. He took a deep breath and walked inside, greeting the receptionist with a friendly smile. "Good morning. I'm here to see Mr. Jeff about a loan." The receptionist nodded and directed him to a waiting area. Mr. Johnson sat down, feeling a bit nervous but mostly hopeful. He looked around and saw people of all backgrounds doing their banking, which made him feel welcome. After a few minutes, Mr. Jeff called his name. Mr. Johnson stood up and followed the manager to his office. The room was spacious and filled with papers and files, showing that Mr. Jeff was a busy man. They sat down, and Mr. Johnson began to explain his business plans. He talked about his store, his goals, and how the loan would help him achieve them. Mr. Jeff listened carefully, occasionally nodding and taking notes. But as the meeting progressed, Mr. Johnson noticed a change in Mr. Jeff's demeanor. His questions became more pointed, and his comments seemed less friendly. Mr. Johnson tried to stay positive, but something felt off. Finally, Mr. Jeff leaned back in his chair and said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Johnson, but we can't approve your loan at this time." Mr. Johnson was confused and a bit hurt. "Is there something wrong with my application?" Mr. Jeff hesitated before replying. "It's not just about the numbers. We have certain criteria we follow." Mr. Johnson felt a knot form in his stomach. He had always believed in fairness and equality, and this didn't feel right. He decided to ask for more details, hoping to understand the decision better, but instead of providing a clear explanation, Mr. Jeff's attitude changed completely. "Look, we have our policies, and I can't make exceptions." Feeling dismissed and disrespected, Mr. Johnson left the office with a heavy heart. As he walked out of the bank, He couldn't shake off the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The words, "We don't do business with people like you," echoed in his mind, making him even more determined to find a way to fight against this unfair treatment. Back outside, the sun was shining brightly, but Mr. Johnson felt a storm brewing inside him. He knew that changing things wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to take the first step. He thought about his options and realized that if the bank wasn't going to help him, maybe he could do something about the bank itself. With a plan starting to form in his mind, Mr. Johnson felt a newfound sense of purpose. He was no longer just a customer. He was someone who could make a difference. Little did he know his journey to fight racism would lead him down a path he never imagined. As he reached his car, Mr. Jeff appeared again, grabbing his arm tightly. "Wait," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I think we need to talk more about this." Mr. Johnson looked into Mr. Jeff's eyes, searching for any sign of sincerity or hidden motives. Was the manager going to apologize, or was there another twist in this unexpected encounter? The air was filled with uncertainty as they stood there, both unsure of what the next move would be. The tension between them was palpable, and the people around them watched with bated breath. It was clear that something big was about to happen, something that would change both of our lives forever. What would Mr. Johnson do next? Would he stand up against the racism he faced, or would the situation take an even more surprising turn? As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the parking lot, Mr. Johnson felt the weight of the moment. The story was just beginning, and the future was full of possibilities and challenges. Everyone around them held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Mr. Jeff's grip tightened on Mr. Johnson's arm, pulling him back towards the bank's grand entrance. "We need to settle this right now," Mr. Jeff insisted, his eyes flashing with a mix of frustration and something deeper, perhaps regret. Before Mr. Johnson could respond, the bank's alarm suddenly blared, sending a wave of panic through everyone inside. Sirens wailed outside, and people began to scream and scatter. "What's happening?" Mr. Johnson shouted over the noise, struggling to break free from Mr. Jeff's hold. Mr. Jeff's face paled. "It's the police," he said urgently. "There's been a security breach. We need to evacuate immediately." Confusion and fear rippled through the crowd as everyone rushed to leave the bank. Mr. Johnson and Mr. Jeff were pushed towards the exit, the tension between them momentarily forgotten amidst the chaos. As they reached the doors, Mr. Jeff released Mr. Johnson's arm and grabbed his own briefcase, hurrying out of the bank. Outside, the street was filled with flashing lights and the sound of police officers directing traffic. Mr. Johnson tried to catch his breath, his mind racing with questions. "What kind of security breach?" he asked, turning to Mr. Jeff. Mr. Jeff looked around nervously before leaning in closer. "There's been some trouble inside. I need to make sure everything is secure before we can continue our conversation." Mr. Johnson nodded, still trying to process the sudden turn of events. As they stood there, a police officer approached them. "Are you Mr. Jeff?" the officer asked, eyeing him suspiciously. "Yes, I am," Mr. Jeff replied quickly. "Is there a problem?" The officer glanced at Mr. Johnson before responding. "We need to ask you both a few questions about what happened inside the bank. Please come with us." Before Mr. Johnson could protest, the officer gently but firmly took him by the arm and led him towards the police car. Mr. Jeff watched helplessly as Mr. Johnson was escorted away, a sense of dread settling in his stomach. What was really going on inside the bank? And why was Mr. Johnson, who had just faced racism, now being taken away by the police? As the police car drove away, Mr. Jeff realized that the situation was more serious than he had initially thought. He needed to act quickly to protect his reputation and the bank's interests. But how? And what did this mean for Mr. Johnson and his promise to fight against the injustice he had faced? Back inside the bank, the police were securing the area, talking to other customers and employees to piece together what had happened. Mr. Johnson, sitting in the back of the police car, felt a mix of fear and determination. He knew that this was just the beginning of a much larger battle against the racism he had encountered. Meanwhile, Mr. Jeff returned to the bank, his mind racing with worry. He knew he had to find a way to resolve the situation, not just for himself, but for Mr. Johnson as well. The bank's reputation was on the line, and he couldn't let things spiral out of control. As night fell over Springfield, the events of the day left everyone on edge. Mr. Johnson sat in his car, contemplating his next move. He had faced blatant racism today, and now he was being thrust into a situation that he didn't fully understand. But one thing was clear. He was not going to back down. He was determined to uncover the truth and take a stand against the discrimination he had faced. Back at home, Mr. Johnson reached out to his friends and family, seeking their support and advice. Hay encouraged him to stay strong and fight for his rights. Inspired by their words, Mr. Johnson knew that he couldn't do this alone. He needed allies, and he was ready to find them. As the city of Springfield settled into the night, the tension from the day's events lingered in the air. Mr. Johnson and Mr. Jeff were left with unresolved questions and the promise of more challenges ahead. What was the true reason behind the security breach? And how would Mr. Johnson turn this ordeal into an opportunity to fight against the racism he had experienced? The night was quiet, but the storm was far from over. Both men were left wondering what the next day would bring and how their lives would be forever changed by the events that had unfolded. The path to justice and equality was just beginning, and neither Mr. Johnson nor Mr. Jeff knew where it would lead them. As the clock ticked towards midnight, the unresolved tension hung heavy in the air. The story was far from over, and the next chapter promised even more unexpected twists and turns. What would Mr. Johnson discover about the bank? And would he find the strength to take on the challenge that lay ahead? Only time would tell, leaving everyone eagerly anticipating what was to come. After the chaotic events at the bank, Mr. Johnson found himself sitting in a small, cold interrogation room at the Springfield police station. The room was quiet, except for the ticking of a clock on the wall. Mr. Johnson felt nervous and confused. He didn't understand why he was being taken away after trying to get a loan. A kind-looking officer named Officer Ramirez entered the room. "Mr. Johnson, I'm Officer Ramirez. I need to ask you a few questions about what happened at the bank today." Mr. Johnson took a deep breath and nodded. "Okay, I'll help however I can." Officer Ramirez sat down across from him. "Can you tell me exactly what happened to you when you went to the bank?" Mr. Johnson explained how he went to the bank to apply for a loan, how Mr. Jeff refused to help him, and how the alarm went off suddenly. He described the confusion and fear he felt when the police arrived and took him away. Officer Ramirez listened carefully. "Thank you for sharing that. We're just trying to understand the situation better." After a few more questions, Officer Ramirez smiled reassuringly. "It seems like there was a misunderstanding. You're free to go, Mr. Johnson, but if you need anything, feel free to call us." Mr. Johnson felt a wave of relief wash over him. "Thank you, Officer Ramirez." As he left the police station, Mr. Johnson thought about what had happened. He realized that the way he was treated at the bank was unfair and hurtful. Determined to make a change, he decided he wouldn't let this stop him from pursuing his dreams. Back at home, Mr. Johnson talked to his family about the incident. His wife, Lisa, and their 2 children listened intently. "We need to do something," Mr. Johnson said. "We can't let this kind of treatment continue." His friend, Marcus, suggested, "Maybe you can take legal action or speak to the media about what happened?" Mr. Johnson considered Marcus's advice, but felt that wasn't enough. He wanted to make a bigger impact. That's when an idea started to form in his mind. "What if I own the bank?" he thought. "Then I can make sure everyone is treated fairly." The next day, Mr. Johnson began researching how to buy a bank. It wasn't easy, but he was determined. He reached out to investors and shared his vision of a bank that welcomed everyone, regardless of their background. Meanwhile, news of the incident at the bank spread throughout Springfield. People were talking about the unfair treatment Mr. Johnson received. Some supported him, while others were confused about what was happening. Mr. Jeff, the bank manager, felt the pressure mounting. His actions had caused a lot of backlash, and he knew he needed to make things right. He tried to reach out to Mr. Johnson to apologize, but Mr. Johnson was focused on his plan to buy the bank. Weeks went by, and Mr. Johnson worked tirelessly to gather the necessary funds. He attended meetings, pitched his idea to potential investors, and slowly but surely, his plan began to take shape. One evening, as Mr. Johnson was reviewing his progress, his phone rang. It was Mr. Jeff. "Mr. Johnson, I want to apologize for how I treated you. I was wrong, and I want to make things right." Mr. Johnson listened but remained firm. "I appreciate your apology, Mr. Jeff, but I'm taking steps to ensure that everyone is treated fairly at this bank." As the weeks continued, more people in Springfield started to support Mr. Johnson's initiative. They believed in his vision of a fair and inclusive bank. Donations and investments poured in, and soon, Mr. Johnson had enough money to make a serious move. One sunny afternoon, Mr. Johnson met with the board of directors of the bank. He presented his proposal to buy the bank and implement his vision of equality and fairness. The board was impressed by his determination and the support he had garnered from the community. After careful consideration, the board agreed to sell the bank to Mr. Johnson. It was a significant achievement, and Mr. Johnson felt a sense of accomplishment. He had turned a negative experience into an opportunity to create positive change. As Mr. Johnson took over as the new boss of the bank, he felt a mix of excitement and responsibility. He knew there would be challenges ahead, but he was ready to face them. His first priority was to ensure that everyone who walked into the bank felt welcome and respected. On his first day as the new manager, Mr. Johnson held a meeting with all the employees. "We are going to build a bank that stands for fairness and equality," he declared. "Every customer deserves to be treated with respect, and we will make sure that happens." The employees were inspired by his words and felt motivated to support his vision. Together, they began to implement new policies and train staff to provide better service to all customers. However, not everyone was happy with the changes. Some old employees resisted the new policies, and there were whispers of disagreement among the staff. Mr. Johnson knew he had to address these issues to maintain the positive environment he had worked so hard to create. One morning, as Mr. Johnson was preparing for the day, he received a call from a local news station. "Mr. Johnson, we'd like to interview you about your new role and the changes you're making at the bank." Excited about the opportunity to share his story, Mr. Johnson agreed. The interview went well, and his message of equality and fairness resonated with many viewers. People praised his efforts and supported his mission to create a better banking experience for everyone. As the weeks turned into months, the bank began to thrive under Mr. Johnson's leadership. More customers came in, feeling confident that they would be treated fairly. The community started to trust the bank, and its reputation improved significantly. But just as things were looking up, a new challenge arose. A rival bank in Springfield, feeling threatened by the positive changes at Mr. Johnson's bank, began to spread rumors and misinformation. They tried to tarnish the bank's reputation, claiming that the changes were too radical and would lead to financial instability. Mr. Johnson was undeterred. He knew that staying true to his values was more important than anything else. He held town hall meetings, addressed the community's concerns, and continued to focus on providing excellent service to his customers. One evening, as Mr. Johnson was reflecting on the journey so far, he received an unexpected visit from Mr. Jeff. "Mr. Johnson, I want to help," Mr. Jeff said sincerely. "I was wrong before, and I want to support your efforts." Mr. Johnson welcomed Mr. Jeff's support, and together, they worked to strengthen the bank's position in the community. Their combined efforts helped to counter the rival bank's negative campaign, and soon, the truth about Mr. Johnson's bank prevailed. As the story of Mr. Johnson's determination and fairness spread beyond Springfield, he began to receive invitations to speak at conferences and share his experiences. He became a symbol of how one person's courage and resilience could bring about meaningful change. However, with success came new responsibilities. Mr. Johnson had to balance his role as the bank's leader with his personal life. He made sure to spend quality time with his family and friends, finding strength in their support. One day, while walking through the park with his children, Mr. Johnson reflected on how far he had come. From being refused service at a bank to becoming its owner and leader, his journey was a testament to perseverance and the fight against injustice. But just as he was feeling a sense of accomplishment, a sudden phone call interrupted his thoughts. It was an urgent message from one of his investors, informing him of a significant financial issue that threatened the bank's stability. Mr. Johnson knew that this was a critical moment that would test his leadership and the foundation he had built. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, but Mr. Johnson was determined to face the challenge head-on. He gathered his team, including Mr. Jeff, and began strategizing on how to resolve the financial problem. Together, they worked tirelessly, exploring every possible solution to save the bank from potential collapse. As the days passed, the community rallied behind Mr. Johnson and his bank, offering their support and trust. Their collective efforts paid off, and the financial issue was resolved, ensuring the bank's continued success. Through this experience, Mr. Johnson learned the importance of teamwork, resilience, and the unwavering belief in his mission. He realized that while challenges would always arise, his commitment to fairness and equality would guide him through any obstacle. The journey was far from over, and Mr. Johnson knew that there would be more adventures and challenges ahead. But with his family's support, the community's trust, and a dedicated team by his side, he felt ready to continue building a better future for everyone. As the sun set over Springfield, Mr. Johnson looked out of his office window, feeling hopeful and determined. The story of how he turned a moment of discrimination into an opportunity for change was inspiring, and he was eager to see what the future held. The path to equality was long and winding, but Mr. Johnson was committed to walking it with courage and integrity. The next chapter of his journey was just beginning, promising more challenges, triumphs, and the unwavering pursuit of justice for all. One chilly winter morning, Mr. Johnson was sitting in his office, reviewing the bank's latest reports. Suddenly, his phone rang loudly. It was one of his trusted investors, Mrs. Davis. "Mr. Johnson, we have a big problem," she said urgently. "There's been a major financial issue that could put the entire bank at risk." Mr. Johnson felt his heart race. "What kind of problem?" he asked, trying to stay calm. Mrs. Davis sighed. "One of our biggest investments has gone sour. If we don't act quickly, we could lose a lot of money." Mr. Johnson knew he had to act fast to save the bank he had worked so hard to build. He called an emergency meeting with his team, including Mr. Jeff. Everyone gathered in the conference room, looking worried but ready to help. "We need to find a solution to this financial crisis," Mr. Johnson began. "Any ideas?" Mr. Jeff spoke up. "We could reach out to the community for support. Maybe we can organize a fundraising event or get more investors on board." Another team member, Sarah, suggested, "What if we cut some unnecessary expenses and reallocate those funds to cover the loss?" Mr. Johnson nodded thoughtfully. "Both are good ideas. Let's work on a plan that combines these approaches. We need everyone's support to get through this." The team worked late into the night, brainstorming and organizing their strategies. They reached out to local businesses, organized community events, and even launched a crowdfunding campaign. Slowly but surely, the support started to come in. People in Springfield believed in Mr. Johnson and his vision for a fair and inclusive bank. Just when things seemed to be getting better, another unexpected challenge arose. A group of employees from the rival bank, who had been spreading rumors about Mr. Johnson's bank, decided to take drastic measures. Late one night, they broke into the bank and tampered with important financial records. When Mr. Johnson discovered what had happened, he was furious and heartbroken. "How could they do this?" he exclaimed. "All we've been trying to do is make things right." He immediately called the police and secured all the bank's data to prevent further damage. The community was outraged by the actions of the rival bank's employees and rallied even more behind Mr. Johnson. Donations poured in, and the support for his bank grew stronger than ever. Despite the setbacks, Mr. Johnson remained determined. He knew that standing up against racism and unfairness wasn't easy, but he believed it was the right thing to do. With the help of his loyal team and the supportive community, he began to rebuild the bank's finances and reputation. One day, as Mr. Johnson was reviewing the updated financial reports, he noticed something alarming. There was a large sum of name missing from one of the accounts. It looked like someone had been siphoning funds without anyone noticing. Something is seriously wrong, Mr. Johnson thought. We need to find out who did this and why. He decided to launch a thorough investigation into the bank's finances. He brought in experts and worked closely with his team to track down the source of the missing money. As they dug deeper, they uncovered a web of deceit and betrayal that went deeper than they had imagined. Just when they thought they were getting closer to the truth, Mr. Johnson received a mysterious message. It was a threatening note warning him to stop his investigations or face the consequences. The message was clear. Someone was desperate to keep the bank from succeeding. Mr. Johnson felt a chill run down his spine. Who would want to stop us? He wondered. And how far are they willing to go? Determined not to be intimidated, Mr. Johnson gathered his team once again. "We can't let fear stop us," he declared. "We need to stay strong and find out who's behind these attacks." As they continued their investigation, the tension in the bank grew. Trust became an issue as they realized that the betrayal could be coming from within. Mr. Johnson had to navigate not only the financial challenges, but also the emotional strain of dealing with deceit and threats. One evening, as Mr. Johnson was about to leave the office, he noticed someone watching him from the shadows. He called out, "Is someone there?" A figure stepped forward, and Mr. Johnson recognized Mr. Jeff. "Mr. Jeff, what are you doing here?" he asked, surprised. Mr. Jeff looked uneasy. "I need to talk to you, Mr. Johnson. It's important." Before Mr. Johnson could respond, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the office into darkness. A loud crash echoed through the room, and Mr. Johnson felt a surge of fear. What was happening? Was this the rival bank making another move against him? In the darkness, Mr. Jeff grabbed Mr. Johnson's arm tightly. "We need to stay calm and figure this out together," he whispered. Suddenly, the lights came back on, and Mr. Johnson saw that some important files had been destroyed. "Who would do this?" he exclaimed. "We're getting closer to the truth." As they stood there, trying to make sense of the destruction, Mr. Johnson received a call on his phone. It was Officer Ramirez from the police. "Mr. Johnson, we have new information about the financial issues and the missing money. We need you to come down to the station immediately." Mr. Johnson felt a mix of frustration and urgency. "I'm on my way," he replied, knowing that every moment counted. He and Mr. Jeff hurried to the police station, where Officer Ramirez was waiting with a serious expression. "We've discovered that the missing funds were redirected through a complex network of accounts," the officer explained. "It appears that someone within the bank was involved from the beginning." Mr. Johnson's heart sank. "Are you saying one of our employees is responsible?" Officer Ramirez nodded. "Yes, and we have reasons to believe it was orchestrated by someone with access to high-level information." Mr. Johnson looked at Mr. Jeff, who seemed unusually tense. "Do you have any leads?" he asked. Officer Ramirez handed him a file. We found evidence pointing to one of your longtime employees, someone who had been with the bank since you took over." Mr. Johnson opened the file and saw that it was about one of his trusted staff members, David. He felt a wave of disbelief. "David, he's been loyal and dedicated to the bank." Officer Ramirez sighed. "We're not sure yet, but we need to investigate further. It's possible that David was being blackmailed or coerced into helping the rival bank." Mr. Johnson felt a mix of emotions: betrayal, anger, and concern. "We need to talk to David and get to the bottom of this." As they prepared to leave the St. Aishan, Mr. Johnson couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of control. The challenges seemed endless, and the threats were becoming more personal, but he refused to give up. He was determined to protect his bank, his team, and the community that believed in him. Back at the bank, the staff was anxious about the ongoing investigations and the recent attacks. Mr. Johnson gathered everyone for a meeting. "I want to assure you all that we are doing everything we can to resolve these issues," he said firmly. "We will get through this together." The employees nodded, feeling a sense of solidarity and hope. They trusted Mr. Johnson and believed in his leadership. Together, they continued to work towards making the bank a place of fairness and equality. As the days went by, Mr. Johnson and Officer Ramirez worked closely to uncover the truth behind the financial sabotage. They discovered that David had been approached by members of the rival bank, who threatened to ruin his family if he didn't comply with their demands. Feeling trapped and desperate, David had no choice but to participate in the scheme. Determined to help David and bring the culprits to justice, Mr. Johnson decided to confront him. He arranged a private meeting in his office, hoping to understand what had happened and find a way to support his employee. When David arrived, he looked ashamed and fearful. "Mr. Johnson, I'm so sorry," he began, his voice trembling. "I never wanted to hurt the bank. They threatened my family and I didn't know what else to do." Mr. Johnson felt a surge of compassion. "David, thank you for telling me the truth. We will help you and make sure those responsible are held accountable." Together, they worked with the police to gather evidence and expose the rival bank's scheme. It was a difficult and emotional process, but with the support of the community and the unwavering determination of Mr. Johnson, they were able to bring the truth to light. One day, as Mr. Johnson was reflecting on the challenges they had overcome, he received another urgent call. "Mr. Johnson, we've found the main orchestrator behind the sabotage. They're planning something big, and we need you to help us stop it." Mr. Johnson felt a chill run down his spine. "What is it?" Officer Ramirez replied. "There's a plan to take over your bank through legal and financial maneuvers. We believe they want to eliminate your leadership and take control." Mr. Johnson knew that this was the most critical moment yet. "We need to act fast and protect the bank and our community. Let's gather the team and prepare for whatever comes next." As he hung up the phone, Mr. Johnson felt a mix of fear and determination. The battle was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher. He knew that the next steps would require all his courage and the support of everyone around him. With the community by his side and a team that believed in his vision, Mr. Johnson was ready to face the final showdown. The fate of the bank, his dreams, and the fight against racism and injustice hung in the balance. What would happen next? The answer was still unfolding, and Mr. Johnson was prepared to do whatever it took to ensure that fairness and equality prevailed. The tension was thick in the air as the clock ticked closer to the impending confrontation. The story was reaching a pivotal moment, and everyone was on edge, wondering how it would all end. The journey had been long and filled with obstacles, but Mr. Johnson's resolve had never wavered. The next chapter promised to be the most intense yet, leaving everyone eager to see how the brave man would overcome the final challenges and secure a better future for his bank and community. The days leading up to the showdown were tense. Mr. Johnson spent hours in meetings with his legal team, reviewing every detail of the rival bank's plot to seize control. The orchestrators had filed a legal challenge claiming that Mr. Johnson's management was financially irresponsible and posed a risk to the bank's stability. The allegations were baseless, but they were enough to warrant a hearing before a financial oversight board. In Springfield, news of the impending legal battle spread quickly. The community, now deeply invested in Mr. Johnson's fight, organized rallies and petitions to show their support. Local businesses put up signs reading, "We stand with Mr. Johnson," and customers flooded the bank, eager to help in any way they could. On the morning of the hearing, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. The courtroom was packed with supporters, journalists, and representatives from the rival bank. Mr. Johnson sat at the front with his lawyer, Ms. Carter, a sharp and fearless attorney who had a reputation for winning tough cases. The rival bank's lawyer, Mr. Greaves, was a smug, well-dressed man who exuded confidence. He began by presenting their case, painting Mr. Johnson as an inexperienced and reckless leader whose policies endangered the bank's future. Ms. Carter stood to counter their claims. "My client, Mr. Johnson, has not only stabilized this bank, but has turned it into a beacon of fairness and inclusion. These allegations are nothing more than a desperate attempt to undermine his success." Over the next few hours, both sides presented their evidence and arguments. Ms. Carter called witnesses, including employees and customers who testified about the positive changes Mr. Johnson had implemented. The rival bank's team, on the other hand, relied on manipulated data and half-truths to support their claims. Just when it seemed like the case was evenly matched, Ms. Carter revealed her ace. She introduced evidence of the rival bank's sabotage efforts, including records of financial tampering and the threats made to David. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as Ms. Carter presented documents linking key rival bank executives to the scheme. Mr. Greaves tried to dismiss the evidence, as circumstantial, but it was clear that the tide had turned. The oversight board members exchanged glances, their expressions serious. The rival bank's plot was unraveling before their eyes. After hours of deliberation, the board announced their decision. Based on the evidence presented, we find the allegations against Mr. Johnson to be unfounded. Furthermore, we recommend a full investigation into the actions of the rival bank. Cheers erupted from Mr. Johnson's supporters as relief washed over him. He shook Ms. Carter's hand, thanking her for her hard work. The rival bank's executives, meanwhile, slinked out of the courtroom, their plan in ruins. The victory was sweet, but Mr. Johnson knew it wasn't the end. That night, he gathered his team to discuss the next steps. "We've won this battle, but we need to stay vigilant," he said. "Our focus remains on serving the community and ensuring this bank continues to stand for fairness and equality." The following weeks were filled with rebuilding and strengthening the bank's operations. Mr. Johnson introduced new security measures and transparency policies to prevent future sabotage. He also reached out to David, offering him counseling and a chance to redeem himself. David, grateful for Mr. Johnson's forgiveness, became one of the bank's most dedicated employees. Just as life at the bank seemed to return to normal, another unexpected twist occurred. One morning, Mr. Johnson received a package at his office. Inside was a thick stack of documents and a note that read, "You don't know the whole story. Meet me tonight at 8 p.m. Come alone." The note was unsigned, and the handwriting was unfamiliar. Mr. Johnson's instincts told him to be cautious, but his curiosity got the better of him. That evening, he drove to the address listed in the note, a small diner on the outskirts of Springfield. Inside, the diner was nearly empty. A lone figure sat in the corner booth, their face obscured by the shadows. As Mr. Johnson approached, the figure looked up, and he recognized them immediately. It was Mr. Greaves, the rival bank's lawyer. "Mr. Johnson," Greaves said, motioning for him to sit. "I think it's time you learned the truth about what's really going on." Mr. Johnson sat down, his mind racing. "What are you talking about?" Greaves leaned in closer, his voice low. "The sabotage, the legal challenge, It wasn't just about your bank. There's a larger conspiracy at play, and you've only scratched the surface. Mr. Johnson felt a chill run down his spine. Why are you telling me this? Because I was a pawn in this game too, Greaves admitted. The people behind this aren't just targeting you. They're planning something much bigger, and if you don't act now, it might be too late. Greaves slid the stack of documents across the table. Everything you need to know is in here, but be careful. These people don't play fair. As Mr. Johnson left the diner clutching the documents tightly, he felt a mix of fear and determination. What could be bigger than the fight he had already faced? Who were these people and what were they planning? Back at home, Mr. Johnson opened the documents and began to read. The information inside was shocking, a detailed plan to manipulate the entire financial system of Springfield, using tactics that included bribery, intimidation, and even threats of violence. The plan implicated powerful figures in the city, including politicians and business leaders. Mr. Johnson knew he couldn't face this alone. He needed allies, people he could trust, to help him expose the truth and protect the community. As he prepared to take the next step, he felt the weight of the challenge ahead. The stakes were higher than ever, and the fight for justice was far from over. The next morning, Mr. Johnson called an emergency meeting with his team. "We're facing a new kind of threat," he told them, "but we've come this far together, and I know we can overcome this too." As his team rallied around him, Mr. Johnson felt a renewed sense of purpose. The battle ahead would be his toughest yet, but he was ready to face it head-on. The fate of not just the bank, but the entire community was at stake. And so, the fight continued, with new dangers and challenges waiting around every corner. Mr. Johnson's resolve never wavered, and the story of his determination inspired everyone around him. What would happen next? The answers were yet to be written, but one thing was certain. Mr. Johnson wasn't giving up without a fight. The revelation of a larger conspiracy shook Mr. Johnson to his core. The stack of documents from Mr. Greaves painted a chilling picture of corruption and greed, stretching far beyond the rival bank. It was clear that powerful figures were manipulating Springfield's financial systems for personal gain, with devastating consequences for the community. Mr. Johnson knew this was a fight he couldn't win alone. The next morning, he reached out to his trusted allies Ems, Carter, Officer Ramirez, and Marcus, his lifelong friend and advisor. Together, they devised a plan to expose the corruption while safeguarding the bank and the people of Springfield. "We need solid evidence to back these documents," Ms. Carter said. "The allegations in here are explosive, but we'll need to verify every claim before we take it public." Officer Ramirez nodded. "I can involve my team to conduct a thorough investigation. If these claims are true, we'll need to move quickly to stop any further damage." Over the next few weeks, the group worked tirelessly, piecing together the puzzle. They interviewed whistleblowers, analyzed financial records, and even enlisted the help of ethical hackers to uncover hidden transactions. The deeper they dug, the more the conspiracy unraveled. The findings were damning. Key figures in Springfield's government and business community were implicated in a scheme to redirect public funds, exploit vulnerable businesses, and inflate housing costs to line their own pockets. At the center of it all was the rival bank's CEO, Mr. Halston, who had orchestrated the sabotage of Mr. Johnson's bank to eliminate competition. With the evidence in hand, Mr. Johnson and his team knew it was time to act. They organized a press conference inviting local and national media to reveal the corruption to the world. The community, already rallying behind Mr. Johnson, showed up in droves to support him. On the day of the press conference, the atmosphere was electric. Standing at the podium, Mr. Johnson took a deep breath before addressing the crowd. "Today, we are here to shine a light on the darkness that has been lurking in Springfield for far too long. This is not just about one bank or one business, it's about justice, fairness, and the future of our community." He laid out the evidence methodically, naming names and providing undeniable proof of the corruption. The crowd gasped as the magnitude of the scheme became clear. Reporters scrambled to capture every detail, while the implicated figures in the audience looked visibly shaken. As Mr. Johnson concluded his speech, he said, "This is not the end, it is only the beginning. Together, we can rebuild Springfield into a community where honesty and fairness are not just ideals, but realities. I stand here today not just as a businessman, but as a member of this community, ready to fight for what's right." The response was overwhelming. The story made headlines nationwide, sparking investigations and legal actions against those involved. Mr. Halston and several others were arrested, and sweeping reforms were introduced to prevent such corruption in the future. With the conspiracy dismantled, Mr. Johnson's bank became a symbol of resilience and integrity. Customers poured in, not just from Springfield but from neighboring towns, drawn by the bank's reputation for fairness. Mr. Johnson expanded the bank's reach, opening new branches and creating jobs for the community. Years later, as Mr. Johnson stood in the lobby of the bank's headquarters, now a bustling hub of activity, he felt a deep sense of pride. The journey had been long and filled with challenges, but he had stayed true to his values and emerged stronger. A young boy approached him, holding his mother's hand. "Mr. Johnson, my mom says you're a hero. Is that true?" the boy asked innocently. Mr. Johnson knelt to the boy's level and smiled. "No, son. I'm just someone who believed in doing the right thing. And you can be that too." As the boy beamed, Mr. Johnson looked around at the thriving bank and the diverse, smiling faces of its staff and customers. He knew that the fight against racism and injustice was far from over, but he also knew that one person's determination could spark a change that rippled through generations. Mr. Johnson's story became a part of Springfield's history, a testament to the power of resilience, integrity, and the unwavering belief that fairness could triumph over prejudice. And as he walked back to his office, he felt ready for whatever challenges the future might bring, knowing he had a community standing firmly behind him.